Hot News PETA holds news conference on tuberculosis in monkeys. Lisa Jones-Engel, PETA's senior science advisor for primate experimentation, called for the Food and Drug Administration, FDA, to stop doing scientific testing on monkeys and called for the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, CDC, to ban the importation of monkeys, characterizing it as a biosecurity issue. The risks are known, the evidence is clear, and yet the threat continues, said Lisa Jones-Engel.
Good morning. Thank you, Ashley, and thank you all for joining us. My name is Elka Chamna, and I serve as Vice President of PETA's Laboratory Investigations Department. I've been at PETA for 22 years, and it's my job to expose cruelty, violations, and bad science in laboratories and to shut them down. We are here today to confront an urgent issue that impacts public health, science, and animals. Each year, a handful of profiteers import tens of thousands of endangered long-tailed macaque monkeys for use in painful and deadly experiments. PETA's team of scientists has uncovered the devastating and dangerous consequences of this trade. It is my honor to introduce our speaker today, Dr. Lisa Jones-Engel. Dr. Jones-Engel is a primatologist, a primate scientist, and a Fulbright Scholar alumna. She spent more than 30 years in the primate biomedical industry, including 17 years at the University of Washington and its affiliated National Primate Research Center. Her career began with documenting how pathogens, including tuberculosis, simian retroviruses, herpes B, malaria, and dangerous bacteria circulate among primates in the very countries that supply the U.S. monkey trade. She went on to lead an international team funded by the U.S. Department of Defense, DARPA, and NIH, whose groundbreaking research showed how easily infectious disease agents move at the human-primate interface in Asia. That work later expanded to uncover the biosecurity risks and pathogen flow in the global primate trade. Her expertise in this field is unparalleled, and her deep knowledge of the dangers posed by this industry is what led her to PETA, where she now serves as Senior Science Advisor for Primate Experimentation. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Jones-Engel.
Good morning, and thank you for being here today. I'm going to share evidence that reveals why PETA is calling on the Department of Health and Human Services to end the importation of monkeys into the U.S. laboratories. The CDC's own data show that tuberculosis-infected monkeys imported from Southeast Asia and Mauritius made it through federal quarantine and into U.S. laboratories, carrying multiple strains of TB, including a strain that we have never seen before here in animals. A new peer-reviewed CDC paper, quietly published behind a paywall, confirms this. Tuberculosis sickens 10 million people and kills 1.25 of them every year. It's the world's leading cause of death from a single infectious agent, according to the World Health Organization. This deadly disease is coming into the U.S. and, ironically, going into the laboratories that are supposed to be curing diseases. Now, TB is not just a monkey disease, or not just, TB is not just a human disease. Monkeys are bridge hosts, capable of cross-species transmission, shedding the mycobacteria through their breath, their saliva, their urine, their feces. Every infected monkey flown into the U.S. threatens to not only expose humans, but also cattle, other domestic animals, and even wildlife, magnifying the danger far beyond the confines of the laboratories. The CDC claimed that between 2013 and 2020, virtually no TB-infected monkeys entered U.S. quarantine. But between 2021 and 2024, their own data showed that 69 infected monkeys arrived on 17 separate shipments. Each year, the number of shipments increased with infected animals. Even worse, the CDC's quarantine missed nearly 1 in 5 infected monkeys. Half of those missed animals came from shipments where another monkey had already tested positive. You don't need to be an epidemiologist to see the recklessness of this. So here's the picture. Hundreds of monkeys packed in wooden crate, diseased, distressed, flown from Southeast Asia or Mauritius, countries that the CDC admits have lax biosecurity. Some test positive in U.S. quarantine, and still the CDC clears the rest of the shipment and releases those animals. Between 2021 and 2024, this happened again and again. So what happens next? In some cases, monkeys cleared from quarantine were diagnosed 27 months later with the same strain that had already been detected in their original shipment. In other cases, new strains surfaced months down the line. And in many cases, no strain data were reported at all, meaning we have no idea what type of mycobacteria tuberculosis those animals were carrying. The implication is unavoidable. The CDC knowingly releases thousands of imported monkeys that have been exposed to TB during quarantine. And by releasing exposed monkeys, the CDC seeded reservoirs of TB in laboratories and breeding facilities across the nation that house tens of thousands of additional monkeys. And it does not stop there. States that house monkeys are kept in the dark because there is no requirement to report post-quarantine TB cases to state officials. Everything relies on the voluntary reporting by importers. So in effect, the CDC has adopted a don't ask, don't tell policy for monkey tuberculosis. And finally, remember this. The study behind those findings covered 0.001% of the nearly 100,000 monkeys that were imported during that 2021 to 2024 period. The true scope of infection is almost certainly much larger. Ironically, the authors' papers bemoaned their lack of data and concluded that they could be more responsive to the public health impacts of failing to detect TB among imported monkeys during quarantine if they knew how frequently they were missing infections. This from the agency that is still clinging to an outdated tuberculosis skin test, a crude and notoriously insensitive tool that misses many infections. Worse still, the CDC's report, which is in your packet that we've shared with you, glosses over latent TB entirely and the testing blind spot that this creates. Despite that fact, the macaque monkeys, like humans, can carry the TB mycobacteria silently for years before reactivating and shedding. By ignoring latency, overlooking apparently healthy monkeys, and relying on a centuries-old test, the CDC all but guaranteed that infected monkeys would slip through quarantine and into labs, creating a persistent source of infection that endangers workers, public health, and the integrity of the research itself for which these monkeys were brought into the U.S. in the first place. Experimenting on monkeys is ineffective to begin with, but doing so on already sick animals guarantees failure. This isn't a testing labs, it is a biosecurity crisis that should have shut down the pipeline years ago. CDC scientists confirmed 4 distinct strains of TB in just the handful of monkeys that they were made aware of. Evidence that this is not an isolated occurrence, but a sustained pathway for introduction and circulation of one of the world's most deadliest infections. Once inside U.S. colonies, TB infections compromise research validity, they waste millions in taxpayer dollars, and have resulted in documented human exposures. This is an escalation of an issue that the CDC has failed to deal with for years. In 2019, during the period that the CDC had said no TB-infected monkeys are really coming in, the Oregon National Primate Research Center imported monkeys, which had been cleared by the CDC, but turned out to be latently infected, setting back projects that those animals were assigned to for years. A few years prior to that, at that same facility, at the Oregon National Primate Research Center, they had a much larger outbreak of tuberculosis among imported monkeys. And in 2023, in Spain, smack dab in the middle of this surge in TB cases, monkeys imported from Vietnam passed screening in Spain, but were later confirmed TB positive. Vietnam, a known TB hotspot, was exporting monkeys to the U.S. at the very same time. So across more than a decade, spanning continents, and the very supply chains feeding U.S. labs, these cases reveal a systemic failure, not an anomaly. So why then does the CDC's limited and troubling data downplay the crisis, contradicting TB figures from another federal agency? In September of 2024, again, you'll see this in your packet, PETA filed a FOIA request with the USDA's National Veterinary Services Laboratories for all records of monkeys with imported TB between January 2023 and August 2024. The result? 96 TB-infected monkeys in just 18 months, a staggering figure that dwarfs what the CDC had admitted publicly in their study, which covered 48 months. When I asked the lead author of the CDC's new study about that gap, I didn't get data, I didn't get analysis, or even an attempt at an explanation. Instead, I was told to, quote, submit questions through the CDC's Division of Media Relations. When the CDC tells scientists to ask PR about a biosecurity gap, that is willful blindness. And that is why TB-infected monkeys are slipping into U.S. labs. The CD has halted imports before: rabies in dogs, Ebola restin in monkeys, monkeypox in rodents, even the threat of SARS from civets. But with TB in monkeys, they've left the door wide open. This isn't an unknown risk. Workers in primate labs have already been exposed. Some have been infected when TB slipped through quarantine. And unlike other pathogens that triggered decisive action, TB was allowed to keep circulating through monkey imports, creating a persistent biosecurity threat. And all of this risk serves no significant scientific purpose. The Food and Drug Administration does not require monkeys for drug testing or mandated safety studies. Their continued use is driven by habit, institutional inertia, and the industry's preference and profit, not by any legal or scientific mandate. Yet the U.S. continues to import tens of thousands of monkeys each year from countries with documented tuberculosis problems, supplying pharmaceutical companies, contract research organizations, and even federal agencies like the National Institutes of Health and the Department of Defense. The corporations driving this trade, Charles River Laboratories, Worldwide Primates, Innovative, and Alpha Genesis Inc., are amongst the largest monkey importers. This is a pipeline built on willful blindness. The risks are known, the evidence is clear, and yet the imports continue. Stopping this threat means shutting down the international monkey importation line. PETA calls on the Department of Health and Human Services to end this crisis today by halting the imports of monkeys into U.S. laboratories. This isn't only about animal suffering. Though the cruelty in this trade, in this pipeline, is staggering, this is about national security. The CDC's own data prove the danger is real, Keeping the pipeline open is a choice, and one that this government can no longer justify. We must close our borders to disease. Thank you, and I'm happy to take any questions.
Thank you, Dr. Jones-Daniel. I thought that the issues here are so complicated. There are so many dimensions to this issue that we might profit from having a bit of a Q&A here. So, to begin with, we see these crates to the left of us. Can you describe what these crates are, what they represent, and what the implications are of these sorts of crates for the public health concerns around the primate trade?
Thank you, Alka. Yeah, I've spent 30 years in this industry. I was at the monkey farms in Asia where these animals come from. These crates are very, very similar to how they're boxed up. You'll have multiple animals in them. They're coming from Indonesia, Mauritius, Vietnam, Cambodia. These monkey farms, we've been told that these monkey farms provide healthy, well-characterized, purpose-bred, captive-bred animals. Well, we've certainly seen from Department of Justice investigations that's not the truth. They're more likely to be wild-caught animals. When the order comes in, anywhere from 120 to 720 of them will be boxed up into crates. The nets are thrown over top of them. They're loaded onto the airplanes. Those trips can last up to 48 hours as they're going from perhaps Cambodia to Houston or Miami or JFK, Chicago, the ports of entry for primate importers into this country. During that time, the animals are screaming, but they're also bleeding, and they're urinating, and they're defecating, and they're vocalizing. So any pathogen that they had within them is now coming out of them. There is a little bit of opening that allows airflow. Okay, tuberculosis is also an aerosolized pathogen. So anything these animals come in with, they are bringing with them, and throughout every step of this pipeline, those pathogens can then be exchanged. And they stay in these boxes until they hit the CDC quarantine.
I think about the fact that the monkeys who are put in these crates many of them are taken from the wild, they're stolen from the wild. Others are bred in these facilities in Asia or in Mauritius. Could you please describe these facilities for us? Give us a picture of what they look like.
You know, I have my scientist as an infectious disease expert hat on. I'm going to put on my primatologist hat here. The way that these animals are, so the thing about macaques, which is the monkey that's been chosen, this long-tailed macaques, they live in large multi-male, multi-female groups. The industry has taken to capturing entire troops of them from the forest, and they do that by going to their sleeping tree at night, putting a net down, chopping all the other trees down, and then as the animals wake up in the morning, they come running down, and there's a free-for-all at that point. These macaques will fight to the death to protect each other, and that's often what happens. So the animals that do survive the initial capture, they're wounded, they're broken, they go into the monkey farms. The monkey farms themselves are fetid. That is actually, I think that is the key descriptor of them. The animals are stressed out. They're no longer with their family. They're terrified. Yes, they're being fed. Yes, they're provided water. But these animals are no longer, they're basically at that point biological ticking time bombs. Because all the pathogens that they've been exposed to, which their immune systems when they're in the wild can hold on to, can keep locked down, basically their immune system comes apart in captivity. And that's why we see things like latent tuberculosis basically literally start coming out of them through their saliva, their feces, their urine. These facilities are indescribably horrific.
I think that's something we can relate to. We know that if we're very stressed, it's harder for us to fight an infection, and that's what's going on with the monkeys, is what you're telling us. So they're in these crates for 40 hours. Where exactly in an airplane, first of all, are these monkeys sometimes held in passenger airlines?
Yes. Ethiopian Airlines actually transports these animals from Mauritius, also sometimes from Southeast Asia, on the same planes that they transport passenger airlines. Just yesterday, we actually got a notice that SmartLynx, another charter airline, was bringing in monkeys from Mauritius and had been cited by the USDA for a violation because, again, these shipments are very large. You might have 70, 80, 100 or 200 crates. SmartLynx had packed all the crates on top of each other, and so that right in the middle were crates of monkeys with other crates stacked on top of them. So imagine that. There's no airflow. The only thing those monkeys could experience was the smell of fear and the sound of fear around them. The USDA pointed out, you know what? You can't transport monkeys like that. But that was, SmartLynx got caught. But again, it was not an anomaly. These animals are transported as cargo in many cases. They're boxed up, they're roped up, they're plastic wrapped with the idea that somehow that's the most efficient way of moving them.
That's really troubling. And you know, sometimes when I'm flying, I like to watch the flight status to know how much longer is the flight going to be. And you know, I'm anticipating that we're going to land soon. Now these monkeys, you said that some of these flights, the travel time can be as long as 40 hours, and these monkeys don't know what's happening to them.
Not only do they not know what's happening to them, monkeys don't belong in planes. Monkeys belong in the forests. Monkeys belong in the villages. Monkeys belong in their natural habitats. But on these flights are literally hopscotching across the globe. Cambodia, to Tbilisi, to Delhi, to Brussels, to Iceland, to Boston, to Miami. That is a very common route. They'll stop in Canada on the way as well and let some monkeys, offload some monkeys. Imagine that the takeoff and descent every time for them, the sound, the feeling, the smell, the terror it's a level of cruelty that is almost inconceivable. So again, this is a horrifically cruel industry, but this is also an industry that has absolutely defied what it's supposed to be doing. We've been told we use monkeys to improve human health. Disease-distressed monkeys do nothing for human health.
Thanks, Lisa. I want to bring the conversation now to the United States because at present the CDC is permitting monkeys to be brought into the U.S. for biomedical experimentation, testing pharmaceuticals, that sort of thing. I have heard you talk about the CDC quarantine sites, and you describe them as black sites. Can you tell us why you describe these sites as black sites?
So recall that taxpayers pay for the vast majority of this experimentation. And yet, the CDC will not disclose where the overwhelming number of their primate quarantine facilities are. The other thing that CDC doesn't tell everyone, again, 30 years in this industry, I thought CDC quarantine meant that CDC officials were the ones conducting the 31-day quarantine, conducting the tuberculin skin test. No, it's actually the importers themselves, the Charles Rivers, the worldwide primates, the inactive. These monkeys come off the plane, they're driven to those facilities, we have no idea where they are, and then it is the job for the importer to conduct the test. The conflict of interest on this is staggering, and we have been telling CDC about this since 2022. We have been raising this issue with them, and their response has been, everything looks good to us. Now, their latest paper makes it clear that everything is truly not good.
Absolutely. I thought what you said was really interesting, that it's like a don't ask, don't tell policy that's in place. Could you please expand on that a little bit?
The CDC said in this paper that they just published, you know, keeping monkeys in quarantine is expensive. It slows things down by giving the authority, essentially, and the responsibility of observing these animals in quarantine to the importers themselves. The CDC has said, and then telling the importers, if you choose to test for something and you find that the animal is positive for melioidosis or malaria or Yersinia or Campylobacter or Shigella, you have to then tell us. You can imagine then that the desire to actually look is very, very limited. So the importers have the choice to look, but if they do, then they have to report. So that is one of the many reasons all of these diseases that we list on these posts have come in with monkeys who have cleared quarantine.
That's really troubling, Lisa. And I know that the ask that you have here at the Department of Health and Human Services to the CDC is that it ban the importation of monkeys into the U.S. Now, is that a reasonable request? Is there a historical precedent for this sort of thing?
Absolutely. The CDC has done it before. There was a ban from 2021 to 2024 for bringing dogs in from rabies endemic areas. In 2004, with SARS, civets were banned. And I think it was in 2001, African rodents were banned when they were found bringing in monkeypox. Ebola restin, which was brought in by monkeys back in the late 80s, there was a temporary halt on monkeys brought in from the Philippines. Just in 2015, the Philippines itself actually halted any exports of monkeys because they were discovering Ebola restin and simian hemorrhagic viruses in their colonies. The CDC has demonstrated that they have the power and the ability to shut this down. But for some reason, with TB, the door has been left wide open.
I'm glad you mentioned Ebola restin because I think, we're here in Washington, D.C. Restin is in the larger DMV, D.C., Maryland, Virginia. Close to Dulles Airport is Reston, Virginia. Can you tell us exactly what happened with Reston Ebola? And I recall, I'll just put this in there, it was a company called Hazelton that imported these monkeys from the Philippines. I believe there were 3 shipments of monkeys, and these monkeys harbored a new strain of Ebola, which is a hemorrhagic fever disease. Now that company, Hazelton, was then renamed Covance. Covance was purchased by Invigo, and Invigo was recently bought up by Inotiv. And Inotiv, I heard you mentioning in your remarks, Dr. Jones-Engel, I heard you mentioning Inotiv as one of the major players that imports monkeys from Asia and perhaps Mauritius. Would you comment on the Ebola restin situation and the rest?
So in 1988, shipments of monkeys came in from the Philippines. They were in the facility in Reston, and the animals started bleeding. They were bleeding from their noses, they were bleeding from other places. That's terrifying. You don't want to see blood coming out of a monkey. We already knew we as a scientific community, we knew about Ebola. So our first thought was, oh my God, this is a filovirus, a hemorrhagic virus. Protocols were put in place. Some workers seroconverted. We discovered that Ebola restin wasn't as pathogenic to humans as it was to monkeys, or as Ebola had been to other humans. But the other thing about the Ebola restin that isn't really mentioned a lot is how many other facilities it was found in once the CDC started doing some retrospective looking. And I think that is key to what we're talking about with TB today. when you look for these pathogens, when you have an agency that's committed to that, you will find them. You will find every single one of those in facilities. And that's because when you have importers like Innovative, who has demonstrated that they will, any animal that walks or swims, they will use. These animals are coming in from the wild. Many of them are trafficked. A wild monkey can pick up infections out in the wild that a purpose-bred monkey would never have. And if we're not looking for them, if we're not screening adequately. Now, I want to be absolutely clear. Filoviruses are is the only other virus during quarantine that the importers are required to report and look for. So we've been burned by the Ebola restin. The fear of death was put into the scientific and the import community with that virus. TB is a much more insidious pathogen. The problem with TB is they're not bleeding out of their eyes. They might be coughing. They might be losing weight. They might have diarrhea. These are all very non-specific symptoms. And I think that is one of the big reasons that the CDC and the importers have said, hey, you know, he's just got a little cough. Tummy's a little bit upset. Got a little bit of IBD kind of here. And they are not testing for tuberculosis. And that has meant that over the last several decades, we have seeded every single one of the colonies, primate colonies here in this country, with tuberculosis. And there is no getting rid of it.
That's really troubling. And as you were speaking, Dr. Jones-Engel, I remember that the whole scenario with restin Ebola was actually documented by Richard Preston in his book, The Hot Zone. And I believe that was made into a movie as well. But I recall looking through articles from that time, 1989, early 1990, where I know that medical military personnel had to go in hazmat suits to try to address the situation. And eventually I know that with the very third shipment of these diseased monkeys, they just allowed the monkeys to die from this Ebola restin. This was an aerosolized form of Ebola, which had never been seen before. You know, I feel like back in 2020, we all got a crash course in pandemics with the COVID pandemic and thinking about mutation of viruses and so on. Would you care to comment on that?
So here's the thing about when you are infected with tuberculosis. Your immune system has basically collapsed. You know, which means that you are much more susceptible to other infections, any of these others that are here that you might have been holding on to, or that you might actually now be exposed to because of your cage mate next door who's been in that colony for years. The other thing about using monkeys infected with tuberculosis, the definition of a model, of an animal model, or any model, it is only as good as it is well characterized. As an investigator, if you don't know that that animal that you're putting your experimental compound into is already infected with another pathogen that has activated its immune system, when you pull bits and pieces out of that animal and you look at it under a microscope, or you look at it in your lab test, you actually don't know whether that inflammation that you're seeing is a reflection of your experimental manipulation or that undetected tuberculosis infection that the animals are having. It is one of the many reasons that the primate model has consistently, for decades, failed to lead to any meaningful improvements in human health because we simply don't even know what's going on in those animals.
I like how you've steered this conversation to this issue of data that we get from other primates, like the macaques who are used extensively in the biomedical experimentation industry. And we've talked about how they're used extensively in pharmaceutical testing. Could you please comment on that?
You know, there is absolutely nothing special about the long-tailed macaque's immune system. They're not more like us. We actually have not shared a common ancestor with these monkeys for 24 million years. 24 million years of evolution means that our biology, our immunology, our physiology is very, very different. The only reason these animals are being imported is because it was convenient. There used to be a lot of them in Southeast Asia, millions. Now, the IUCN, the International Union for the Conservation of Nature, has elevated the status of these animals to endangered, in part because of their extraction from the wild for biomedical use. This is not a magic monkey. This monkey is not going to give us the answers about, whether or not new compounds are safe or effective. In fact, 90 to 95% of the time, the answer they get from the monkey does not translate into the same answer in humans. And so here we have driving a species to extinction, importing biosecurity threats, TB, malaria, melioidosis, hepatitis, herpes B, and we are spending taxpayers' money. We have violated basically the U.S. Research pipeline, and not just the pipeline of monkeys. All U.S. research that involves monkeys have been contaminated. So the CDC and the importation companies have seeded every single one of the colonies in the U.S. with TB-infected animals. And the only step forward is to shut this importation industry down. And this is what we want the Department of Health and Human Services to do. They have the authority. We're asking them to stop this today before the next plane is loaded up and the next 500, 700 monkeys are brought in.
Thank you very much.
Thanks.
Thanks so much, everyone. If there are no further questions, we will wrap up this portion of our press conference. But if you'd like to do individual interviews, just let us know. Thanks so much.